My name is Audrey Wilson, and at 32, I never imagined my data analysis skills would make me both a hero and a pariah in the same day. When Brandon Miller joined FastTrack as head of growth, everyone was dazzled by his charm and impressive numbers. Everyone except me. Something about those client retention statistics seemed wrong, but questioning a rising star could end my career. Then I found proof he was fabricating everything. The decision I made next cost me weeks of sleep, but saved our company millions. If you are watching this right now, let me know where you are tuning in from. Hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories about standing up for what is right in the corporate world. FastTrack Marketing Agency occupied 3 floors of a gleaming glass building in downtown Chicago. When I joined 4 years ago, we had about 50 employees and a reputation as an up-and-coming digital marketing firm that specialized in data-driven campaigns. Now we had over 200 staff and a client roster that included several Fortune 500 companies. Our rapid growth had been both exciting and chaotic. I had not planned on a career in marketing. With my degree in statistics and finance from Northwestern University, I had spent 3 years at a financial analysis firm before a college friend recruited me to help FastTrack build out their analytics department. The idea of applying my quantitative skills to marketing campaigns intrigued me, and the promise of a more creative environment than my buttoned-up financial firm was appealing. "We need someone who can translate data into actionable insights," my friend had said. "Someone who can tell the truth about what is working and what is not." The truth, that word would come to haunt me later. In the beginning, FastTrack lived up to its promise. Our CEO, Thomas Harrington, had built the company on the premise that data, not just creative intuition, should drive marketing decisions. He was in his mid-50s, soft-spoken but decisive, and he had a genuine passion for building a company with integrity. During my first year, he would regularly stop by my desk to ask about metrics on various campaigns, listening carefully to my explanations. "This is why we need analysts like you, Audrey," he would say. "Numbers do not lie." My direct supervisor, Lisa Wilson, was equally supportive. As director of analytics, she had built a small but mighty team that prided itself on rigorous methodology. Lisa was in her early 40s with a calm demeanor and sharp mind. She had a PhD in economics and treated data analysis almost as a moral calling. "Our job is to be the truth tellers," she often reminded our team. "Sometimes that means telling people things they do not want to hear." Among my other colleagues, Ethan Parker in client services became a friend early on. Tall and perpetually enthusiastic, he was genuinely interested in using our data to improve client outcomes. Jennifer Morgan, our HR director, was pleasant but conflict-averse, always looking for ways to smooth over disagreements rather than address underlying issues. And Michael Davis, our CFO, was a quiet, methodical man who rarely spoke in meetings but whose eyes missed nothing. For nearly 3 years, I thrived at FastTrack. My analyses helped refine campaigns. My recommendations were implemented, and I even developed a client retention tracking system that became a company standard. The culture was collaborative, and while we worked hard, there was a sense that we were building something worthwhile together. Everything changed when Brandon Miller arrived. Thomas introduced him at an all-hands meeting as our new head of growth, a position created specifically for him. Brandon was 38 with the polished good looks of someone who belonged on the cover of a business magazine. His resume was impressive. MBA, from Wharton's successful growth roles at 2 well-known tech companies, and a stint at a prestigious consulting firm. "Brandon is going to take us to the next level," Thomas announced, a rare excitement in his voice. His track record speaks for itself. Brandon took the podium with practiced ease. "I am thrilled to join the FastTrack family," he said, his voice confident and warm. "What Thomas has built here is impressive, but I see potential for exponential growth. My specialty is accelerating companies past the plateau that typically happens at this stage." He outlined ambitious growth targets that made some of us exchange glances. 50% year-over-year client growth, doubling our average contract value within 18 months. These were not just aggressive goals. They seemed almost fantastical in our competitive industry. But Brandon had a way of making the impossible sound inevitable. His presentation was slick, filled with impressive case studies and testimonials from his previous roles. By the end, even the skeptics were applauding. Everyone wanted to believe. The restructuring came a week later. Several departments, including analytics, would now report through Brandon instead of directly to Thomas. Lisa tried to maintain her usual calm when she informed us. "This will streamline decision-making," she said, though her tight smile suggested she was less than thrilled. "Brandon has a lot of experience with data-driven growth strategies." I remembered the moment Brandon first visited our department. While he was friendly to everyone, there was something calculating in the way he assessed each of us. When he came to my desk, his handshake was firm, his smile practiced. "Audrey Wilson," he said, "I have heard good things about your client retention tracking. I have some ideas about how we can optimize that further." Something in his tone made me uneasy, a subtle hint that my work was merely adequate rather than the robust system my clients had praised. I smiled back professionally, but as he moved on to the next desk, an uncomfortable feeling settled in my stomach. "He seems very confident," I said to Lisa later. "Yes," she replied after a pause. "Let us hope it is justified." I could not have known then just how unjustified it would prove to be, or how expensive that confidence would become for all of us. The atmosphere at FastTrack shifted almost immediately under Brandon's leadership. Where before we had operated with a collaborative spirit and reasonable targets, suddenly everything was about aggressive growth and outperforming competitors. Weekly team meetings became pressure cookers, with Brandon pacing at the front of the room like a general rallying troops for battle. "We need to think bigger," became his constant refrain. "We are leaving money on the table with this conservative approach." His management style quickly revealed itself. When campaigns succeeded, Brandon was quick to highlight his strategic direction as the critical factor. When initiatives failed, he skillfully redirected blame to execution issues or market conditions. Most concerning was his treatment of those who questioned his approach. Pointed remarks, subtle undermining, and sometimes outright dismissal became common tactics. My first uncomfortable direct interaction with Brandon came about 6 weeks after his arrival. I had prepared my standard quarterly client retention report, a methodical analysis that tracked not just overall retention rates, but the specific reasons clients stayed or left. "This is too complex," Brandon said, barely glancing at the 20-page report I had spent weeks preparing. "Clients do not care about methodology. They want to see growth." "But understanding why clients leave is crucial for improving retention," I explained. "This report has helped us increase retention by 12% year over year." Brandon leaned back in his chair, fixing me with a look that was both dismissive and challenging. "That is old school thinking, Audrey. Modern growth metrics are not about explanations. They are about trends. And the trend I need to show is up and to the right." He proceeded to request a simplified version, with more impressive visuals and less focus on churn causation. I left his office feeling as though I had somehow failed, despite knowing my analysis was sound. The following week, reviewing the client dashboard, I noticed the first real discrepancy. The retention rate Brandon had presented to the executive team was 89%, but my calculations showed 84%. Not a massive difference, but statistically significant over our client base. During our next department meeting, I raised my hand when Brandon asked for questions. I noticed a difference between the retention figures in the executive presentation and our internal dashboard, I said, keeping my tone neutral and professional. I wanted to confirm which methodology we should be using for consistency. Brandon's smile never faltered, but something hardened in his eyes. "Good question, Audrey. The executive dashboard uses a forward-looking retention model that factors in anticipated renewals. Your system only captures historical data. Both have their place, but for growth planning, we need to be forward-looking." It sounded reasonable on the surface, but it made no statistical sense. You cannot count clients as retained before they actually renew. That is not a forward-looking model. It is an unverified assumption at best, and a deliberate misrepresentation at worst. That is not how retention is calculated in any standard marketing metric I am familiar with, I said, immediately regretting my direct challenge, as his expression darkened. "Well, Audrey," he replied with exaggerated patience, "this might be why you are analyzing data and I am directing growth strategy. You are just not understanding modern growth metrics. We will discuss this offline." The offline discussion never happened, but the damage was done. In subsequent meetings, Brandon would often introduce my analysis with subtle caveats. "This is Audrey's perspective, though there are other ways to interpret the data." Or Audrey brings a very traditional analysis approach which has its place. My confidence began to waver. Was I being too rigid? Was there some innovative approach to metrics that I was failing to grasp? I spent evenings researching the latest in marketing analytics, confirming that, while there were certainly evolving methodologies, the basic principles of honest reporting remained unchanged. The relief of validation was short-lived. At the next monthly review, Brandon presented client retention rates of 92%, a figure so disconnected from reality that I nearly gasped. Our actual retention by any standard calculation was hovering around 82%, which was still respectable in our industry. My anxiety grew as I watched other worrying signs emerge. Account managers were increasingly stressed working weekends to meet impossible targets. 3 senior staff members resigned within a month. Client complaints about misaligned expectations began to increase. One afternoon, Stephanie from accounting stopped by my desk ostensibly to ask about expense categorization. Once we were alone in a conference room, she leaned forward. "Is it just me, or are the numbers not adding up?" she asked in a low voice. The revenue projections Brandon is using for the quarterly forecast seem completely disconnected from our actual billing. That brief conversation was both validating and terrifying. I was not imagining things, but the problem was apparently even more widespread than I had realized. Brandon must have sensed the growing questions. He implemented a new policy that all client-facing presentations had to be reviewed and approved by him personally before delivery. For message consistency, the memo stated, but the effect was clear: he now controlled all information flowing to clients. The final straw came during a meeting with Pacific Northwest Retail, one of our largest clients. I was presenting campaign performance data when the client's marketing director interrupted. "These conversion rates seem much higher than what we are seeing in our internal tracking," she said, frowning at my slides. "And frankly, they do not align with the actual sales impact we have measured." Before I could respond, Brandon smoothly took over. "Great observation, Laura. There is often a lag between the marketing funnel metrics and your sales data. What Audrey's showing are the optimized channel metrics before your internal attribution model applies. We should set up a separate call to reconcile the two systems." It sounded plausible, even helpful, but it was complete nonsense. There was no mysterious lag or reconciliation issue. Either our campaigns were delivering the results we claimed or they were not. After the client left, Brandon put a hand on my shoulder, his grip just tight enough to be uncomfortable. "Next time, let me handle the metrics portion of the presentation. Stick to the campaign creative elements." That night I could not sleep. If we were misrepresenting results to clients, we were not just being dishonest, we were potentially committing fraud. But challenging the head of growth, the CEO's handpicked star, would be career suicide without irrefutable evidence. I made my decision at 3 a.m. I would conduct my own investigation methodically and discreetly to determine exactly what was happening with our numbers. If I was wrong, no one needed to know. But if I was right, I would need indisputable proof before taking action. Little did I know that this decision would ultimately save the company but throw my life into chaos. The next morning, I created a secure password-protected spreadsheet on my personal laptop. I would never use company time or resources for this investigation, both for ethical reasons and to protect myself. This would be my nights and weekends project until I had clarity. I started by reconstructing our client retention figures from raw data sources. FastTrack used several systems that did not automatically integrate our CRM for client information, a project management system for campaign tracking, the billing system for contract values and renewal dates, and our proprietary analytics dashboard for performance metrics. This fragmentation made it possible for someone to present selective data without others easily spotting inconsistencies. My approach was methodical. I exported historical data from each system, focusing on the past 2 years, divided clearly into pre-Brandon and post-Brandon periods. The patterns began to emerge after my 3rd late night. In the official retention reports, Brandon presented clients who had given notice of non-renewal were still counted as active until their final day. Clients on free trial extensions after failing to see results were counted as retained. Most egregiously, clients who had reduced their contracts by more than 50% were still counted at their original contract value in growth calculations. The technical term for this is misrepresentation. The non-technical term is lying. By my second week of investigation, I had reconstructed accurate client retention calculations and compared them with the figures Brandon had presented to the executive team and board. The divergence was no longer subtle. Our actual client retention had dropped from 84% before Brandon to 76% after his arrival, while his reports showed an increase to 94%. The moment of discovering the full extent of the deception hit me physically. I remember sitting at my kitchen table at 1 a.m, staring at the 2 trend lines on my screen, feeling sick to my stomach. This was not a minor discrepancy or a difference in methodology. This was a deliberate fabrication designed to make Brandon look like a miracle worker while the company was actually losing clients at an accelerating rate. To verify my understanding, I researched industry standards for marketing agency metrics, confirming that my calculation methods aligned with accepted practices. I even reached out to a former mentor who now taught marketing analytics at the university level, careful to keep the conversation hypothetical. If someone were calculating retention by counting clients who had given notice as still active, would that be considered a valid methodology? I asked over coffee. My mentor nearly choked on her drink. That is not a methodology, Audrey. That is fraud. With growing certainty but increasing anxiety, I approached Lisa, my supervisor. We met off-site at a quiet cafe several blocks from the office. I have been reviewing our client retention data. I began carefully, and I have found some concerning discrepancies between the raw data and what is being presented to leadership. Lisa's expression remained neutral, but I noticed her hands tighten around her coffee cup. What kind of discrepancies? I showed her my analysis on my laptop, walking through my methodology and findings. As she reviewed the stark comparison between actual and reported figures, her face grew pale. Have you shared this with anyone else? She asked quietly. No, just you. I wanted to get your guidance on how to proceed. Lisa closed her eyes briefly. Audrey, I appreciate your thoroughness and your concern, but you need to understand that Brandon has the CEO's complete trust. Thomas brought him in specifically to accelerate growth after our investors pushed for more aggressive expansion. The board is thrilled with the results Brandon is reporting. But those results are not real, I insisted. We are losing clients faster than ever before. I understand that, Lisa said, her voice barely above a whisper, and I have had my own concerns. But previous attempts to question Brandon's methods have been firmly rebuffed. One of the directors who raised similar issues was let go during the last restructuring. The implication was clear. Pursuing this could cost me my job, and possibly Lisa's as well. I left our meeting with a heavy heart but an unchanged conviction. Someone had to address this before it spiraled further out of control. Meanwhile, Brandon seemed to sense the walls closing in. His behavior toward me shifted from dismissive to openly hostile. In meetings, he would cut me off mid-sentence or redirect questions meant for me to other team members. The weekly analytics review, once a collaborative session, became a tense ordeal where he would pick apart minor details in my reports while glossing over substantive findings. The situation escalated when Brandon announced he would personally present the quarterly client performance review to North Star Technologies, a presentation that had always been my responsibility. The night before, I spent hours ensuring the data was accurate and the conclusions justified by evidence. The next morning, as we prepared for the client's arrival, Brandon casually informed me, I have made some adjustments to your slides. Just follow my lead. When the presentation began, I was horrified to see that my carefully prepared charts had been replaced with versions showing dramatically improved performance metrics. Campaign ROI that I had calculated at 130% now displayed as 210%. Conversion rates were inflated by nearly 50%. I sat silently through the presentation, professional smile, frozen in place as the client team grew increasingly excited about results that simply did not exist. When they left, Brandon received congratulations from Thomas, who had attended the final portion. This is exactly why we brought you on, Thomas told him, clapping him on the shoulder. North Star was considering reducing their contract, and now they are talking about expanding. As the room cleared, I gathered my materials, trying to process what had just happened. Brandon approached, his voice low but intense. I need you on board with the growth story, Audrey. Your pessimistic data focus is becoming a problem. The numbers should reflect reality, I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. We are making promises to clients that our campaigns cannot deliver. Brandon's face hardened. The campaigns will catch up to the projections. That is how ambitious targets work. You create the expectation and then rise to meet it. That is not how data works, I countered. And it is not how client trust works either. Let me make something very clear, he said, stepping closer. I was brought in to accelerate growth, and that is what I am doing. Your job is to support that narrative, not undermine it. You need to show some gratitude for being part of this success story, instead of constantly looking for problems. The confrontation left me shaken but more determined than ever. That evening, I discovered a smoking gun, an email thread accidentally copied to me where Brandon instructed a designer to adjust the visualization to show the trend we need, and explicitly acknowledged that the raw data does not support our growth story yet. But perception drives reality in this business. It was the confirmation I needed. This was not a misunderstanding or different methodology. Brandon was knowingly misrepresenting data to clients and company leadership alike. I now face the hardest decision of my career: remain silent and be complicit in fraud, or speak up and potentially lose everything I had worked for. The Sullivan Enterprises meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. They were our oldest and most prestigious client, accounting for nearly 15% of our annual revenue. Their 3-year contract was up for renewal, and Brandon had been personally handling the relationship for months. The stakes were enormous. Losing Sullivan would not just hurt our bottom line, it would raise questions about our agency's performance that might prompt other clients to reevaluate their partnerships with us. Brandon had assured Thomas that the renewal was 99% locked in, with a likely increase in contract value. I was invited to the meeting to present specific analytics on campaign performance, strictly following the slides Brandon had approved. The conference room was tense with anticipation as the Sullivan team arrived. Their chief marketing officer, David Sullivan himself, led a team of 4 executives into the room. Brandon was in his element, charismatic and commanding, as he walked through our strategic vision for the next phase of the partnership. When he reached the section on performance results, he presented a client retention slide, showing that campaigns managed by FastTrack retained customers at a rate 35% higher than industry average. My stomach twisted. Our actual retention impact was closer to 12%. Still respectable, but nowhere near the figure Brandon was claiming. Worse, he was using this inflated statistic as justification for a 20% increase in Sullivan's contract value. When David Sullivan turned to me and asked, "Can you walk us through the methodology behind these retention calculations?" I felt the weight of all eyes in the room. We use a multi-touch attribution model, I began carefully, that tracks customer engagement across channels. The retention impact is measured by comparing customer cohorts who were exposed to our campaigns versus control groups. And that consistently yields a 35% improvement, he pressed, looking at my face rather than the slides. There was a heartbeat of silence. I could feel Brandon staring at me, willing me to confirm his lie. The 35% figure represents our best case performance in optimal conditions, I said, choosing my words with agonizing precision. The average impact across all campaigns and segments is more moderate. It was the most diplomatic way I could avoid directly lying, while also not explicitly contradicting Brandon. David Sullivan's eyes narrowed slightly, but Brandon smoothly interjected before he could ask a follow-up question. What Audrey means is that we see varying performance across different customer segments, with some exceeding that 35% benchmark. For Sullivan specifically, we are confident in achieving that level of impact with our proposed strategy enhancements. The rest of the meeting continued, with Brandon masterfully addressing questions and concerns, always steering the conversation back to future possibilities rather than verifiable past performance. By the end, David Sullivan seemed satisfied, if not entirely convinced. "We will review your proposal and get back to you next week," he said as they prepared to leave. As soon as the Sullivan team departed, the conference room erupted in celebration. Thomas shook Brandon's hand enthusiastically. "Brilliantly handled," he said. "I think we have got them." Brandon accepted the congratulations with practiced humility, but his eyes found mine across the room, cold and warning. The message was clear: get on board or get out of the way. Later, as I gathered my materials from the conference room, Brandon cornered me by the door. "What was that?" During the presentation, he demanded, voice low but intense. You nearly derailed the entire renewal. I answered the question accurately, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I cannot lie to clients about our performance. No one is asking you to lie, Brandon hissed. This is business. We present the most favorable interpretation of our results. Everyone does it. There is a difference between favorable interpretation and making up numbers, I countered. Brandon stepped closer, using his height to intimidate me. You need to show some gratitude instead of undermining me at every turn. I brought this company to new heights. Client contracts have doubled under my leadership. The board is thrilled with our growth trajectory. Growth based on false promises is not sustainable, I said, clutching my laptop to my chest like a shield. Your problem, Audrey, is that you do not understand the big picture, he said dismissively. Data analysts get lost in the details and miss the vision. That is why people like me run growth. And people like you make charts. The condescension in his voice was the final straw. The weeks of anxiety, late nights verifying data, and ethical compromises crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. This man was destroying the company I cared about, exploiting the trust of clients who relied on us, and undermining the work of colleagues who believed they were contributing to legitimate success. People like you should not be running anything, I said quietly. You are a fraud, Brandon. And sooner or later everyone will know it. His face contorted with rage, and for a moment I thought he might actually strike me. Instead, he composed himself with visible effort. Be very careful, Audrey. People who cannot be team players do not last long here. As he stormed away, I noticed two junior analysts standing nearby, having witnessed the entire exchange. Their wide-eyed expressions reflected the same fear and discomfort I had been feeling for months. That night, I did not go home. Instead, I went back to my desk and created the slide that would change everything. It was elegantly simple, a single chart showing client retention rates over the past 3 years. The trend line was clearly divided into 2 periods, before Brandon and after Brandon. The contrast was stark and undeniable, with a steady upward trajectory, suddenly reversing into a sharp decline, precisely when he took over. The visualization was perfect in its simplicity, the kind of clear data story that required no complex explanation. Anyone seeing it would instantly understand what was happening. At 10:30 that evening, I sent an email to Michael Davis, our CFO, requesting a brief meeting the following morning. Unlike Brandon, Michael had always struck me as fundamentally honest, if cautious. His response came within minutes. 7:30 a.m. My office. Michael reviewed my slide and supporting documentation in silence, his expression growing more grave with each page. When he finally looked up, his eyes were troubled. You understand what you are doing here, he said. It was not a question. Yes. Brandon was Thomas's personal selection. The board sees him as the future of the company. This will not just end his career, it could have serious repercussions for everyone involved. Including the clients who are making decisions based on fabricated data, I asked quietly. Michael sighed deeply. I have had my own concerns about the numbers. They seemed too good to be true, but I could never pin down exactly how they were being manipulated. You have been extremely thorough. What should I do? I asked, realizing I was seeking not just strategic advice but moral guidance. Officially, as CFO, I cannot advise you to publicly contradict our head of growth in front of the CEO and potentially clients, he said carefully. The company could face legal exposure, client defections, and significant financial damage. My heart sank. Unofficially, he continued after a pause, as someone who has spent 30 years building a reputation for integrity. I believe that false reporting eventually destroys companies from within. The truth has a way of emerging, usually in the most damaging way possible and at the worst time. He handed back my documents. The quarterly all-hands meeting is tomorrow morning at 9. Thomas always opens the floor for questions after the executive presentations. Whatever you decide, Audrey, be prepared for the consequences. I barely slept that night, replaying every possible scenario in my mind. Best case, Thomas would recognize the deception, Brandon would be removed, and the company would begin the painful but necessary process of rebuilding trust with clients and employees. Worst case, I would be labeled a troublemaker, fired immediately, and potentially blacklisted in the industry. By morning, my decision was made. I loaded my presentation onto a USB drive, dressed in my most professional outfit, and headed to the office for what might be my last day at FastTrack Marketing. The quarterly all-hands meeting was held in the largest conference room, with additional employees joining via video from our smaller offices. By 8:45, the room was packed with people standing along the walls and sitting cross-legged in the front. There was the usual pre-meeting energy, a mix of excitement and obligation as people caught up with colleagues from other departments. Thomas opened the meeting promptly at 9, welcoming everyone and highlighting the agenda. "As you know, we have had an extraordinary year of growth," he began, his voice proud. "Today, we will hear from each department about their contributions and plans for continued expansion." Several department heads presented brief updates, but it was clear everyone was waiting for Brandon's growth report. When he finally took the podium, there was an anticipatory hush. "Good morning, FastTrack family, Brandon," began his confidence filling the room. "I am excited to share some remarkable achievements from the past quarter." His presentation was slick and visually impressive, filled with upward trending graphs and impressive statistics. The centerpiece was his client retention slide, showing our retention rate at an unprecedented 94%, with average contract values increased by 28%. "These are not just numbers," he said, gesturing to the screen. "These represent the trust our clients place in us and the extraordinary value we deliver to them every day." As he spoke, I felt my heart pounding so hard. I was certain people nearby could hear it. My palms were sweaty, my mouth dry. I had faced high-pressure situations before, presented to C-suite executives, and managed difficult client conversations, but nothing compared to what I was about to do. Brandon concluded to enthusiastic applause. "Any questions about our growth trajectory?" he asked, clearly expecting none of substance. My hand rose almost of its own accord. Brandon scanned the room and his eyes landed on me. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face before his professional smile returned. "Audrey, our data expert," he acknowledged with a nod that managed to be both recognizing and dismissive. "What can I clarify for you?" I stood, willing my voice to remain steady. "Thank you for the comprehensive presentation, Brandon. I wanted to provide some additional context to the retention figures, if I may." He clearly expected a minor technical clarification, something that would reinforce his narrative while giving me a moment of visibility. "By all means," he said, gesturing magnanimously. "The floor is yours." I moved to the front of the room, USB drive in hand. "May I connect my laptop for a moment?" Brandon stepped aside, his expression still pleasant but with confusion beginning to register. As I connected my computer to the projector and pulled up my file, I could feel the weight of every eye in the room. As many of you know, client retention has been a key focus area for us over the past 3 years. I began, my voice growing stronger with each word. I wanted to share a longitudinal view that I think provides important context for our current situation. My slide appeared on the screen, stark in its simplicity. A single graph showing client retention rates over 36 months, with a clear dividing line labeled before Brandon and after Brandon. The pre-Brandon line showed steady growth from 78% to 84%. The post-Brandon line showed a sharp decline to 76% and continuing downward. There was an audible gasp from the audience. Brandon's reported 94% retention rate was exposed as not just an exaggeration but a complete fabrication. For a moment, the room was absolutely silent. I could see people processing the implications, their eyes moving between my graph and Brandon, who stood frozen beside me. Brandon recovered first, his face contorting briefly before settling into a mask of professional concern. "There seems to be some confusion here," he said, his voice tight. "Audrey is using an outdated calculation methodology that does not account for our new client categorization system. This methodology is consistent with industry standards and our own historical reporting," I replied calmly. "It counts a client as retained only if they remain active with a consistent or increased contract value. It does not count clients who have given notice, reduced their contracts by more than 50%, or been extended on free trials after failed campaigns." Brandon's face flushed. "This is highly inappropriate, Audrey. We can address any methodological disagreements offline, rather than derailing an important company meeting." I turned slightly to face the audience rather than Brandon. I believe this information is relevant to everyone in this room who has been working toward what they thought was extraordinary growth. The reality is that we have been losing clients at an accelerating rate while reporting record retention. That is enough, Brandon snapped, his composed facade cracking. This is a gross misrepresentation based on incomplete data. From the corner of my eye, I saw Thomas staring at the screen, his expression morphing from confusion to dawning horror. Slowly, he put his face in his hands, the gesture of a man watching his world collapse. Brandon advanced toward me, his voice rising. I will not stand here and let a junior analyst undermine months of progress with cherry-picked data points. These are not cherry-picked, I said, standing my ground. I have the complete dataset available for review, including the original exports from our CRM billing system and client management platforms. I can walk through each calculation in detail. Brandon reached for my laptop. This presentation is over. Actually came a voice from the side of the room. I think we should hear more. It was Michael Davis, our CFO, rising from his seat. Audrey, can you explain how you verified these figures? Brandon turned to Michael, betrayal written across his face. This is not the appropriate forum for a technical debate about analytics methodologies. On the contrary, Michael replied evenly. If there is a fundamental discrepancy in how we are measuring and reporting our core business metrics, that seems precisely what we should be discussing. Brandon looked to Thomas for support, but the CEO remained silent, his expression unreadable now, as he studied the graphs still displayed on the screen. Thomas, Brandon appealed directly we should continue this discussion with the executive team in private. After what felt like an eternity, Thomas straightened in his chair. I think we need to understand exactly what Audrey is presenting before we proceed further. His voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the strain underneath. Audrey, please continue. Before I could speak, Brandon made one last desperate attempt. This is a clear violation of confidentiality protocols. These numbers have not been verified or approved for general distribution. Actually, I said, bringing up my next slide, these are the same figures that were presented to the board in March before the adjustments were made for the growth narrative. The slide showed the original report with Brandon's own signature on the cover page containing numbers that aligned with my analysis, not with what he had been reporting since. There was another collective intake of breath from the audience. This was no longer about competing methodologies. It was documented evidence of deliberate misrepresentation. Brandon's face went from red to white. This meeting is over, he announced, unplugging my laptop from the projector. The screen went blue, then black. I think Mr. Miller is right about one thing, Thomas said, standing up. This meeting is over. Everyone except the executive team and Audrey Wilson is dismissed. Please return to your departments. The room emptied quickly, people filing out in stunned silence, whispers beginning only when they reached the hallway. Brandon stood rigidly by the podium, his knuckles white, as he gripped its edges. Thomas, Michael, Jennifer from HR, and two other executives remained seated, their expressions grave. As the door closed behind the last departing employee, Thomas turned to me. Miss Wilson, I believe you have more to share with us. And so the real presentation began. Returning to my desk after the executive meeting felt like walking through a surreal landscape. The office was unnaturally quiet, with people speaking in hushed tones that fell silent as I passed. Some colleagues avoided eye contact entirely, while others gave me subtle nods of acknowledgement or looks of curiosity. I had just sat down when Ethan from Client Services appeared at my desk, his usual enthusiasm replaced by nervous energy. So, that happened, he said quietly, perching on the edge of my desk. Are you okay? Before I could answer, my computer chimed with a new email notification. The sender was Jennifer Morgan from HR, the subject line simply meeting request, immediate. I guess I will find out, I told Ethan, attempting a smile that felt more like a grimace. Wish me luck. The email directed me to conference room C, not Thomas's office as I had expected. When I arrived, I found an intimidating assembly. Thomas at the head of the table, Jennifer from HR to his right, Alan Freeman, our head of legal, to his left, and across from them, looking like he had aged 10 years in 2 hours, sat Brandon. Miss Wilson, please join us, Thomas said, formally gesturing to an empty chair. As I took my seat, Brandon immediately went on the offensive. This is a coordinated attempt to undermine the growth strategy and scapegoat me for organizational resistance to change, he said, his voice controlled, but edged with desperation. Audrey has been selectively interpreting data to support her narrative. Alan Freeman raised his hand slightly. Before we continue, I want to remind everyone that this conversation may be subject to discovery in potential future proceedings. Please be thoughtful about your statements. The implication hung heavy in the air. This was no longer just an internal dispute. There were potential legal ramifications. Thomas turned to me. Miss Wilson, you presented some very serious allegations in this morning's meeting. I need to understand exactly how you came to these conclusions and what evidence supports them. Over the next hour, I walked through my complete analysis, methodically explaining how I had reconstructed the client retention calculations from primary data sources. I showed how Brandon's reported figures diverged from reality, and most damning presented the email thread, where Brandon had explicitly directed the manipulation of data visualizations to show the trend we need. Throughout my presentation, Brandon's interjections became increasingly desperate and contradictory. First, he claimed I was using outdated methodologies. Then he argued that his approach was standard in high-growth companies. Finally, he resorted to attacking my motives, suggesting I was jealous of his position and trying to sabotage him. When I finished, Thomas was silent for several long moments. Finally, he spoke. Brandon, do you deny instructing staff to alter data visualizations to show trends that were not supported by the underlying data? Brandon shifted in his seat. That email is being taken out of context. I was simply requesting clearer visualizations that highlighted the positive trends within the overall data. And the client categorization system that counted clients who had given notice of non-renewal as retained, Thomas pressed. That is a standard forward-looking approach that accounts for potential win-back campaigns, Brandon insisted, though his confidence was clearly waning. Thomas turned to me again. Miss Wilson, did you bring these concerns through proper channels before today's presentation? I attempted to address the discrepancies with Brandon directly on multiple occasions, I replied. I also discussed my concerns with Lisa Wilson, my direct supervisor. Additionally, I met with Michael Davis yesterday morning to review my findings before presenting them. Thomas nodded slowly. I see. At this point, I believe we need a thorough, independent review of all the data and reporting methods. He turned to Jennifer. Miss Morgan, please prepare the paperwork to place Mr. Miller on administrative leave, pending the investigation. Brandon stood abruptly. This is absurd. You are going to take the word of a data analyst over your head of growth. I was brought in specifically to accelerate this company's trajectory, which is exactly what I have done. You are on leave effective immediately, Brandon Thomas said firmly. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings. Please surrender your company laptop and access cards before leaving the building. Brandon's face contorted with fury. He pointed at me. She is destroying everything we built. When clients start leaving because of her doomsday mentality, do not come crying to me. After security arrived to escort Brandon out, Thomas turned to me with a grave expression. Miss Wilson, I appreciate your commitment to accuracy and your courage in bringing this forward. However, I need to place you on paid leave as well during the investigation to ensure a completely impartial process. Though I had anticipated this possibility, the reality still stung. I understand, I said, trying to keep my voice professional. I have all my supporting documentation ready for review. Please provide everything to Alan before you leave today, Thomas said. This is not how I expected this week to end. The walk to my desk, packing my personal items under the watchful eye of security, and the final exit from the building all passed in a blur. By Friday afternoon, I was sitting in my apartment, unemployed for all practical purposes, wondering if I had just committed career suicide. The following week was one of the most anxiety-filled of my life. I alternated between conviction that I had done the right thing and paralyzing doubt about my future. Would any company hire an analyst known for publicly exposing executive misconduct? Had I overreacted to standard corporate growth tactics? The questions circled endlessly in my mind as I waited for news. On Wednesday, an unexpected email appeared in my personal inbox from David Sullivan, the CMO I had met during the Sullivan Enterprises presentation. I heard through the grapevine about recent events at FastTrack. If you're available, I'd like to discuss our account performance in more detail. The next day brought another surprise, a message from a former FastTrack account manager who had left 3 months earlier. Just wanted to say thank you for speaking up. Brandon pushed us to promise clients results we could never deliver. It's why I left. I've already spoken with the investigators about my experience. By the end of the week, I learned that several other current and former employees had come forward with similar accounts, providing additional evidence of data manipulation and client misrepresentation. The investigation was expanding beyond just the retention metrics to all aspects of Brandon's reported growth figures. On Monday morning of the second week, I received a call from Thomas himself. "Audrey, we would like you to come in tomorrow to discuss the preliminary findings of the investigation. I think you will want to hear this in person." The conference room felt different this time. Thomas was there along with Jennifer, and two people I did not recognize who were introduced as partners from the accounting firm conducting the independent review. "First, let me say that the investigation has confirmed the accuracy of your analysis." Thomas began, his expression somber. The client retention figures were indeed being systematically misrepresented along with several other key performance metrics. The lead investigator, a woman in her 50s with piercing eyes, took over. "Our forensic accounting team has identified multiple instances of data manipulation dating back to Mr. Miller's first month with the company. The pattern is consistent with similar issues at his previous employer, which we discovered had experienced a significant client exodus shortly after his departure." Thomas looked genuinely pained. Brandon provided references from his previous role that were glowing. What we did not know was that those references came from executives who had left the company under unusual circumstances themselves. In light of these findings, Jennifer added, "We would like to offer you not only reinstatement but a formal apology from the company. Your actions, while unorthodox in their delivery, ultimately protected FastTrack from continuing down a path that could have led to regulatory issues and significant client litigation." Relief washed over me, followed immediately by a new concern. What about the clients who were misled? And the teams who have been working toward impossible targets? Thomas nodded, acknowledging the question's importance. "That is actually why we wanted to bring you back immediately. We need to conduct a complete review of all client accounts to identify discrepancies between what was promised and what was delivered. It will be a difficult process but essential for rebuilding trust. Some clients will likely leave when they learn the truth," Michael added frankly. "But better to face that now than continue building on a foundation of false data." The next month was among the most challenging in FastTrack's history. Brandon was terminated for cause after the investigation's final report. Several clients did indeed leave when the true performance metrics were revealed. The company's growth projections were revised downward, and a painful restructuring eliminated several positions that had been created based on the inflated growth narrative. Yet amidst the difficulty, something remarkable emerged. Thomas instituted new data governance protocols that required multiple independent verifications of all client-facing metrics. The culture began to shift back toward the integrity-focused environment that had originally attracted me to FastTrack. Most surprisingly, some clients expressed appreciation for our transparency. "We always thought those numbers seemed too good to be true," admitted the marketing director at one of our largest remaining clients. "We respect that you came clean even though it was not the easy path." By the 6-month mark, we had stabilized. Our client base was smaller but more solidly retained. The team was leaner but more cohesive. And perhaps most importantly, we had recommitted to the principle that had made FastTrack successful in the first place, that honest data, even when it tells an uncomfortable truth, is the only foundation for sustainable growth. As for me, the experience left its mark. I had stood up for data integrity when it would have been easier to stay silent, and that decision had ultimately been vindicated. But the weeks of uncertainty and anxiety had taken their toll. I would never again take for granted the importance of an ethical company culture or underestimate the pressure executives face to show constant growth. In the end, the lesson was clear. Numbers tell a story, but only if we let them speak the truth. 6 months after the all-hands meeting that changed everything, I walked into FastTrack's offices with a new title on my door, Director of Analytics and Client Insights. The promotion had come with a significant raise, but more importantly, with a seat at the leadership table where strategic decisions were made. The company had undergone a remarkable transformation. Thomas had emerged from the crisis humbled but determined to rebuild on a stronger foundation. The executive team now included several new faces, including a chief ethics officer whose approval was required for all client-facing performance reports. My relationship with Thomas had evolved from distant respect to collaborative partnership. He regularly sought my input not just on data interpretation, but on broader strategic questions. What I value most, he told me during a recent planning session, is knowing that you will tell me the truth even when it is not what I want to hear. That commitment to truth-telling had become FastTrack's new North Star. We had implemented comprehensive data integrity systems across all departments, with mandatory cross-checks and verification protocols. Reports now included confidence intervals and clear methodological explanations, even if that sometimes meant presenting less impressive but more accurate results. The client recovery process had been painful but ultimately successful. We had lost about 20% of our client base after revealing the actual performance of their campaigns, but those who remained appreciated our transparency. More importantly, we were now able to set realistic expectations and consistently meet or exceed them, rebuilding trust one successful campaign at a time. It is refreshing to work with an agency that does not promise the moon, one client told me recently. When you say a campaign will deliver certain results, we believe you because you have been honest about limitations. My own team had grown to include 8 analysts, each trained not just in technical skills, but in ethical data presentation. I made a point of mentoring them on handling situations where they might face pressure to manipulate results. Your primary loyalty is to the integrity of the data, I told them during orientation. That serves the client, the company, and your own career better than any short-term numbers game. Despite these positive changes, the experience had left its scars. I still felt a flutter of anxiety before major presentations, remembering the confrontation with Brandon. I found myself double and triple checking analyses before sharing them, sometimes to the point of unnecessary delay. And I had developed a certain wariness around executives from other companies who promised dramatic results without clear methodologies. The healing process had been gradual. Working with a trusted team helped. So did the public recognition we received when FastTrack was featured in a marketing industry publication for our new transparency initiatives. But perhaps most healing was the day a junior analyst came to me with concerns about a campaign report that seemed overly optimistic. I could be wrong, she said nervously, but I think the conversion attribution model we are using might be counting the same customers multiple times. Instead of feeling threatened by the challenge, I felt profound relief. The system was working. People felt safe raising concerns. The culture had truly changed. Let us look at it together, I replied, and if you are right, we will fix it immediately. She was right, and we did fix it, adjusting the client report before it went out and implementing new checks to prevent similar issues in the future. When Thomas heard about the incident, he personally thanked the analyst for her vigilance. 1 year after Brandon's departure, FastTrack received an industry award for our innovative approach to marketing analytics and transparent client reporting. As I accepted the award on behalf of the company, I reflected on how different things might have been if I had chosen the safer path of silence. The personal cost had been significant weeks of anxiety, professional uncertainty, and the stress of public confrontation. But the reward had been immeasurable. A company culture rebuilt on integrity, client relationships based on trust, rather than inflated promises, and the professional satisfaction of knowing that my work reflected reality. If I could go back and give advice to my past self in those dark days of investigation, I would say, document everything meticulously. Find allies who share your commitment to truth. Choose your moment of confrontation carefully, making sure you have irrefutable evidence. And remember that even if the immediate aftermath is painful, the long-term benefits of integrity ultimately outweigh the temporary comfort of compliance. The truth is that real growth, whether personal or organizational, only happens when we have an honest assessment of where we truly stand. Fantasy metrics might look impressive in the short term, but they lead to decisions based on illusions rather than reality. And those decisions inevitably fail because they are disconnected from the underlying truth. Today, when I mentor young professionals entering the field of data analytics, I emphasize that their greatest value lies not in producing impressive numbers, but in revealing actionable insights, even when those insights challenge existing narratives. The companies and leaders worth working for are those who want truth, not validation. Have you ever faced a situation where speaking up seemed riskier than staying silent? What did you choose, and how did it affect your career and personal integrity? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with others who might be facing similar ethical dilemmas in their professional lives. Remember, every time we choose integrity over expediency, we help create workplaces where truth is valued and honesty is rewarded. Thank you for listening to my story, and I wish you the courage to stand by your principles even when it feels like you are standing alone.